Pictured here, I have a 3D model of a skeleton. I'm going to start by adding some layers of muscle. So there's first layer, second layer. I'm going to start with the third layer. What I'm going to do is zoom in on our guy here, and we're going to be turning to the right side. So this muscle that I've highlighted in this orange color here, this is going to be the Sternothyroid muscle. Now, this muscle originates from the manubrium of the sternum and inserts onto the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. This muscle is going to depress the thyroid cartilage. I also should mention that we are going to be going from the deep layer to the superficial layer when we are discussing these muscles. This next muscle that you can see highlighted here, I actually might go to the anterior side maybe a little bit. You can see here, this is the Mylohyoid muscle. This is going to originate from the mandible and insert onto the hyoid bone. So you can get all different views. Back them up a little bit. Now this muscle is going to elevate the hyoid bone, the oral cavity, and it's also going to depress the mandible. Now highlighted here are the scalene muscles. This first one here is our anterior scalene muscle. The next one is the middle scalene, and then we have the posterior scalene muscle. All these muscles are going to attach to the cervical vertebrae of the ribs. They help to tilt and rotate the neck. The next muscle that I've highlighted is the Sternohyoid. This muscle attaches to the hyoid bone. It depresses the hyoid bone, and it's important for speaking, chewing, and swallowing. See from an anterior view here. Next muscle that I have highlighted is the Omohyoid. This is going to insert onto the hyoid bone again, and it attaches at the scapular level, as you can see. Sort of move down there a bit so you can see where it attaches. This muscle is going to depress the hyoid bone in the larynx. The next muscle that I have highlighted here is the Sternocleidomastoid muscle. This muscle attaches to the mastoid process, the clavicle, and the sternum. Its action is tilting and rotating the neck and the head. Here is the digastric muscle. This muscle is made up of an anterior and a posterior belly. This may be a bit of an interesting view. I have taken away the skeleton, so we can now see this is still the right side of our person here. So what I've highlighted here is the anterior belly of the digastric muscle. And this piece, which is highlighted here, is the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. The digastric muscle itself elevates the hyoid bone. As you can sort of see here, the posterior belly is longer than the anterior belly. I have added our skeleton back here, and it's sort of difficult to see, but in orange that's highlighted there, that is the Stylohyoid muscle. Now real quickly, I'm going to take away the skeleton so you can see what it looks like without the bones. Okay, so now that I've taken away the skeleton, you can see clearly our Stylohyoid muscle. This is present along the superior border of the posterior belly of the digastric muscle. It's connecting the hyoid bone to the base of the mandible. Its action is pulling the hyoid bone upwards and backwards.
So one tool that can be used to organize all the different structures of the neck is the two triangles. And this is something that you can kind of relate to the different compartments of the limbs, not necessarily in the sense that the compartments have different functions, but mostly to kind of just orient yourself in that part of the body and start associating these different muscles, nerves, and so on with those two individual triangles. So as you can see, I've labeled a number of different muscles that we've already seen. I'm not going to go through them, but in addition, I've also drawn these blue and green triangles. The blue one represents the posterior triangle. It's going to be bordered anteriorly by the sternocleidomastoid, inferiorly by the clavicle, and then posteriorly by the trapezius muscle. And then over on the right side, we have the green representing the anterior triangle. That is going to be bordered posteriorly by the sternocleidomastoid, superiorly by the mandible, and then medially by the midline. And like I said, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will just point out something that is pretty important to our understanding, and that is that if you look in between the anterior and middle scalene muscles, what you will see is the brachial plexus. And I find that, kind of a corny way to remember where it's positioned within the posterior triangle. I know that, all of us are really super interested in biology, but say you graduate and you want to go the business route, what's your next logical step? You're going to want to get an MBA. So just remember that the brachial plexus here is positioned right in between the middle and anterior scalene muscles. So there you go. You're never going to forget it. And then, yeah, just kind of going into the brachial plexus, it consists of the ventral rami, C5 through T1. And so this group of nerves is going to innervate the upper limb. We won't go into all the details because it can be a lot, and that's a discussion for a different day. But essentially what happens is these spinal nerves will go through a process of branching and rejoining back together from their roots to the trunks, followed by the divisions and cords, and finally those terminal branches, which are going to be providing all that innervation to the arm, forearm, and hand.
We will now be discussing the hypoglossal nerve, the vagus nerve, and the phrenic nerve. The hypoglossal nerve is what is highlighted here in purple. This is cranial nerve number 12. This nerve enters the neck through the hypoglossal foramen in the occipital bone. It provides somatic motor innervation to most of the tongue muscles, both intrinsic and extrinsic. This nerve, as you can probably tell, is important for swallowing, eating, and speaking. It stimulates the muscles of the tongue from below, which you can see here because the purple nerve is what's wrapping underneath the mandible, and hypoglossal is Greek for under the tongue. Now we're going to move to our vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is cranial nerve number 10. It's going to enter the neck through the jugular foramen between the occipital and the temporal bones. Vagus nerve I have highlighted here in purple. It provides somatic motor innervation to the muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. Also, it provides general sensory innervation to the larynx. It provides parasympathetic motor innervation to the thoracic and abdominal regions. It's going to travel from the brain to the colon, which makes it the longest cranial nerve. Next nerve we have here is this nerve highlighted in purple. I'm going to back away a little bit so you can see. So this is the right phrenic nerve. Now the phrenic nerve is not a cranial nerve. It is going to innervate the diaphragm, and it branches from the anterior rami of C3, C4, and C5. So if I zoom in here really quickly, you can sort of see the little branches. Let me actually highlight right here for you so you can see. So right here we have the anterior ramus of the fifth cervical nerve, and that is what I mean when I say it branches from the anterior rami of C3 through C5. Lastly, the phrenic nerve passes superficially to the anterior scalene.
All right, so now we want to move into a discussion of the larynx. The larynx is a cartilaginous structure found just inferior to the oral cavity, specifically to the tongue. The larynx serves as the entrance to the trachea, and so it's really important in the process of respiration. It also contains our vocal cords or vocal ligaments. And so it is the origin of kind of like all of the noises that we make. The larynx consists of 9 cartilages in total. And cartilages, what they are basically firm, but really the kind of flexible tissue type. So it's less firm than a bone, but it still is pretty tough. We're only going to talk about a handful of these cartilages. So basically there are 6 paired cartilages and 3 unpaired. All of these are going to be kind of suspended superiorly by the hyoid bone. And the hyoid bone, we can see over there in the anterior view, that is going to be kind of at the top of the larynx there. And so, just to orient ourselves here, we have from left to right, the anterior view, the sagittal view, and the posterior view over there on the right. And, just in terms of our structures, the first one that we're going to look at is the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroid cartilage is this pretty large red cartilage that you can see on the anterior view as well as the posterior view. And one thing that you might know is, from lecture, is that this little protrusion there on the front of the anterior thyroid cartilage, that is going to make up your Adam's apple. Looking over here, kind of at the posterior side of it, we see that it is open, actually, that the thyroid cartilage does not actually enclose around the posterior larynx. And next up, we've got the cricoid or cricothyroid cartilage. That is going to be just slightly inferior to the thyroid cartilage. So you can see it very well on the anterior and posterior views as the yellow tissue. And then also in the sagittal view, you can kind of see that cross section inferior there to the thyroid cartilage. Next up, we want to look at the epiglottis. The epiglottis is actually a very important cartilaginous tissue because what it does is it acts as a flap, and essentially during the process of swallowing, it'll close down kind of on that opening to the larynx and prevent, food or any kind of liquid from getting into the windpipe. And so that is going to be crucial because obviously we don't want anything getting down there. Now, another name for that opening that the epiglottis closes off is the remiglottis. And the remiglottis can be closed or opened depending on the rotation of the arytenoid cartilages, which I'm going to get to that in a second. But essentially, that allows us, like the rotation of those cartilages allows us to produce speech. The vocal, ligaments, essentially the vocal cords that are, going to open and close that remiglottis are actually going to be covered in a layer of mucosa. And whenever that happens, they're referred to as the vocal folds. And you can see those very well here in the sagittal view, those really distinct folds there. And then lastly, we're going to get to, like I just mentioned, the arytenoid cartilages. And those are going to be a set of paired structures. And so they're going to be up kind of at the top of the larynx. And yeah, like I just mentioned, the conformation of the vocal cords is controlled by the rotation of those arytenoid cartilages shown here in the posterior view. And yes, these are essentially the main components of the larynx and the ones that we're going to be focusing on today.
So here are the arteries of the neck. So first, if we start at the aorta, the left side branches into the left common carotid, which will then branch into the left external carotid artery and the left internal carotid artery. Then when we look at the right side, that branches to the brachiocephalic trunk, which will then branch into the right common carotid artery, which will then branch into the right internal carotid artery and the right external carotid artery. And to see what that looks like more in depth, here's a picture. And here's the aorta. And we have the right side and the left side. And here's the right common carotid artery and the left common carotid artery. And they move up all the way the neck into the cranial space. And then here is where the internal carotid artery and external carotid artery splits. And they split at an area we call the carotid sinus, which is important for controlling things like blood pressure. And here is the carotid sinus in this image. And then here is a model to show you what the internal jugular vein looks like. That splits off the brachiocephalic vein and that moves up into the neck and it runs alongside of the common carotid artery. And to see what that looks like in the body, here's what this looks like. Here's the common carotid artery. And to orient ourselves, here is this man's jaw. This is the left side of his face, and this is his left ear. This is his neck. Here's the common carotid artery running up his neck, and then here's the internal jugular vein. And now we will be talking about the glands up the neck. To start, here's the thyroid gland. It has a signature butterfly shape, and it's located inferior to this laryngeal thyroid cartilage. And it wraps around the cricoid cartilage, which is also called the Adam's apple, and tracheal rings. Your thyroid releases hormones that regulate your metabolism, body temperature, muscle strength, and many other bodily functions. To talk about a clinical case, we could talk about Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or also called Hashimoto's disease. And it's a type of hypothyroidism, which means it's an underactive thyroid. And Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an autoimmune disorder, and the condition causes your white blood cells and antibodies to mistakenly attack the cells of the thyroid. And we don't really know why this happens, but some people believe it's due to genetic factors. And it's 7 times more likely to occur in women than men, especially women who have been pregnant. Symptoms of Hashimoto's are not really unique to the disease, so it can be difficult to diagnose. The one diagnosable symptom is a goiter, which is an enlarged thyroid seen here. Treatment, you can use this medication, levothyroxine, which is a way to replace the hormone thyroxine 4. Then we move on to the submandibular gland. And the submandibular gland is at the floor of the mouth, and it's located inferior to the mandible, located right here. And then to look at this picture, this is the bottom jaw, so this is the bottom set of teeth. And here's the submandibular gland. So a clinical case is an aesthetic surgery that some women or men choose to do, and this is a submandibular gland reduction. And it has really no medical purpose. It's really more for aesthetics, and it's to help with contouring the chin and neckline. And it can be a difficult surgery because it's located deep within the fascia of the neck, which makes it a tough part to access. And since it's a salivary gland, it's possible to have side effects of dry mouth. And some other side effects from the surgery are some life-threatening airway compression that can be caused by bleeding deep in the neck. Another symptom is a benign submandibular sialose, which is when the salivary gland has been damaged so much that the saliva leaks in and creates swelling, which can create some cysts in the neck. And in 15% of facelift procedures, they will do this submandibular gland reduction.